Welcome to the Ghost Stories YouTube channel. Here, we will bring you the scariest experiences through ghost stories, mysteries, and inexplicable mysteries of the mysterious world. Whether you are someone who enjoys learning about ghost stories or simply looking for a new entertainment experience, our channel will be the ideal destination. Join us in the horror space and get ready for the most tense and scary moments. Don't forget to press the subscribe button and notification bell so you don't miss any new videos. Thank you for joining the Ghost Stories YouTube channel, and now, get ready for some spooky moments with us.
The soul of a girl who died young. Stories should not be heard at midnight. It's been 2 days since I've been here, but Tien still hasn't come to the alley. All day long he just wandered around the grounds of the house that a friend had kindly lent for Tien to stay in for 2 months to complete his doctoral thesis that he would present next month, which means less than 2 months after the wedding week. "What are you?" Tien turned around and saw an old man waving at him. Surprised, Tien still walked out the gate and politely asked, "Yes, did you call me, right? Seeing that you're a stranger, it seems like you've come to this place and haven't gone out to play around here yet. The scenery is so beautiful." Tien was a bit surprised by the old man's concern, but he was still amused by this concern. "Yes sir, I'm still a bit tired so I haven't gone out yet. Maybe I'll go later. I also heard that this place has very beautiful scenery. If you are interested, follow him, he knows a very strange place, you will probably like it." Tien suddenly became curious and he was also surprised with himself when he accepted. "Yes, I will go with you." He was about to breathe in and take the camera with him, but he seemed to know what the old man meant. You should not take pictures anywhere you find it inappropriate to take pictures. Although he was wondering, he felt it was not convenient to ask, so Tien silently followed. About 15 minutes later, Tien exclaimed, "So beautiful." The old man smiled gently. "It's only a part, the deeper you step inside, the more beautiful it becomes. Do you like staying here or do you still want to go to that place, where there is a very funny cave?" As soon as he heard it, Tien was excited. "Are you close? Less than 200 meters away. If you want, you can follow me." "Yes, let me go with you." Tien ran for a while then had to shout again. "So beautiful. This waterfall is so beautiful, but it's a pity that people don't know how to exploit it. In Dalat, people do not know about it, only around Datanla, Kamli, Pran, Gauga, Pongur. It was forgotten, my dear. This is Dambri waterfall, it is the most beautiful waterfall in this region, but until this year of the pig, no one has thought of the district exploiting it. There, try looking at it." Tien was engrossed in looking, but when he turned around, he could no longer see the old man. He exclaimed, "Uncle!" Hearing no response, Tien had to walk forward alone. Thinking that the old man was in the cave in front of him, Tien called again, "Uncle!" This time there was no response from the old man, but only the echo of his call. Tien entered the cave with a blank mind, until he was startled because in front of him was a very large rock, with no path left. It turns out that this is just a very shallow cave, it cannot be called a cave like many other deep caves. A bit disappointed by the old man's introduction to the cave, he was just about to turn around when he suddenly saw some words on the cliff blocking it. When he first entered, he was not used to looking in the dark and couldn't see them, but now Tien can read each word. "Once loved someone, 1,000 years will never stop remembering. Half a honeymoon, a lifetime." It's hard to understand. The poem was quite long, but in the dark it was impossible to read it all at once, so Tien had to grope for a long time. Finally, He had to stop because at the deep end, the color of the rock darkened and it was difficult to read. However, with the above two sentences, Tien felt excited. He kept rereading them many times, until he memorized them. Once loved someone, 1,000 years will never stop remembering. Half a week to increase honey, for the rest of your life it will be difficult to dissolve. Tien was engrossed in reading poetry and forgot about time. When he stepped outside, he saw that the sun had already risen above his head. Looking at his hand, Tien was startled. It's been more than 3 hours. Tien looked for the old man again but could not find him. When he returned home, the maid gave him a brocade bag and said very clearly, "Sent to you by a strange girl." She sent a message saying, "Don't waste your time finding out who she is, because eventually she will come back to see you." Having heard her say that, what else could Tien ask? He picked up the bag to see what was inside, but the maid said. She told him to only open it when he was in his own room. Tien went back to his room and immediately opened the bag and was surprised to see a beautiful set of women's silk clothes in there. It's the pajamas again. From then until that evening, Tien couldn't figure out who was the person who sent him the basket. Even if he asked Tu Tui's sister again, he couldn't understand anything more, so Tien could only carry that question until he went to sleep. But it's not easy to fall asleep. It's not until after 12 o'clock that Tien can fall asleep. If a person sleeps like the dead, guests will not notice. At first, although he heard that voice, Tien thought he was dreaming, so he remained still. After half a minute, the voice spoke again. "What happens if you keep someone's things and don't return them? It's so cold." Tien felt like someone was touching his leg. It was very ticklish, so he had to get up. And again the voice spoke, this time right next to his ear. "Give me back my clothes." Tien's whole body was cold. He was still confused when a woman's hand touched his hand, along with the urging, "Quickly give me back my clothes, I'm so cold." You are." Tien's sentence had not yet finished when, while groping, he accidentally touched a body with wet clothes, cold as ice. "Miss." Tien could only say that much, then he was motionless, only able to move with the support of the girl who at that time was almost holding him tightly, her head resting on his neck as if she was sucking blood. While Tien felt like he was being electrocuted and his blood flowed uncontrollably, her voice was more intimate. "I'll take that outfit back later." Tien tried to speak clearly, because at that moment he could barely control himself. "Are you the one who sent me the basket? But who else dares to come in here when I owe you the outfit?" "But, you sent it, but I didn't mean to take it, but why did you send it to me and not someone else, that thing?" Tien hesitated pitifully, while she proactively pushed him to lie down and said firmly, "Later, I'll have to dress you again, otherwise you'll leave, as limp as when you arrived." Tien was startled. "You came here without wearing anything?" the girl giggled. "I'm wearing it, but it's all wet." But what if someone sees?" she replied dryly. "Someone saw it?" Tien panicked. "Oh my God, when people see it?" She laughed again. "The only person who sees it is you. As of now." Tien breathed a sigh of relief. "But I thought..." Tien could not say another word and was almost completely motionless. The girl whispered again in his ear, "I still owe you this. The poem I know by heart is yours." Tien shouted. "I wrote on the cliff, no wonder my handwriting is so elegant. I know someone else's poetry but never listened to it. Or have you already forgotten?" Tien immediately blurted out 2 lines of poetry that he knew from the cliff. Finished, he suddenly asked, "Are you a married girl?" She suddenly sighed and fell silent, not talking as quickly as before. Tian thought perhaps he had touched her pride, so he spoke up. "I'm sorry." He wanted to get up, but at that moment, even though she was no longer biting his neck, Tian couldn't move. He had to repeat his words. "I'm sorry, just apologize like that, I owe you twice, but now, so what else do you want me to do? You must marry me." That sentence made Tian panic. "What did you say? I have to marry you to pay off all my debt." As soon as she finished speaking, she jumped down on the bed. Only then could Tian move, and he jumped. But in a flash, she quickly walked out of the room. Only then did Tian regain his composure and follow. There was no sign of her anywhere. Suddenly surprised by the clothes in the bag, Tian took them and ran out to the garden. He called out, "Miss." "What, miss?" The next morning when Tian woke up, he saw that the bag was still there, but when he looked again, there were no clothes inside, but instead was a pair of women's sandals. This means that while he was sleeping, the girl came back. "Miss what?" Tian called again, but like last time, he was disappointed. He put his feet down on the bed and was about to step out, and Tian discovered that his whole body ached as if he had just experienced a serious illness. It took more than 6 o'clock for his dizziness to gradually subside, and Tian hurried back to the waterfall. At the foot of the poem rock, there were clothes thrown haphazardly there. Next to it was a large leaf lying on top. Tian was about to throw the leaf away to pick up the outfit to look at it when he suddenly saw a hastily written message on the leaf: "Wash it and hang it in the room, I'll come get it. Thank you in advance, Yan Vy." Tian was startled. Her name is Yan Vy. Looking closely at the poem on the cliff, below are the two abbreviations YV. Her poetry. Tian was still hesitating when he suddenly heard a voice behind him. "Why are you coming out now?" Turning around and seeing the old man from yesterday standing and looking at him intently, Tian exclaimed. "Hey uncle, I'm looking for." The old man still smiled gently. "I know. But I have to let you meet her first, Miss Yan Vy." The old man nodded slightly. "Right. Do you know her, not only knowing but also being close? How are you and her related?" "Why?" The old man's voice was sad. "I am, its grandfather." "Poor child, at just such a young age, she has suffered so much until she dies and still has no peace." His words startled Tian. "What did you say? She died, Ms. Yan Vy?" His voice was almost crying. "It is already a person of the underworld." Tian remembered the meeting last night and shivered. His voice trembled. "So why did you and her just meet last night?" The old man suddenly said. "It's best for you to end your relationship with him, but sir, I want to meet again too." With a quick wave of his hand, the old man said solemnly. "Should not. Once is more than enough. You helped him like that, it's like you've sacrificed yourself. I don't want another human life." Tian panicked. "Which person's life are you talking about?" The old man suddenly covered his face as if regretting something. His voice became difficult to hear. "I just pleased him. He said he had to find the Doan family, and you were the first and probably the only one." Tian was very surprised. "Doan family? But I'm not that person. My nephew's last name is Duong. I am a friend of that family." The old man suddenly looked up, his face changed. "You said, you're not named Doan?" "Yes, absolutely not. I just came to stay in that house for a while." "But what's the matter?" The old man cried out twice, then hugged his head. "I was wrong. I hurt you." Tian was bewildered. "What's going on, "Bro, what did you do to me?" The old man suddenly grabbed Tian's hand and asked loudly, "Have you and he done anything together?" Tian did not intend to speak, but after hearing him repeat it a second time with a panicked expression, he had to nod. "Yes." The old man let go of his hand and exclaimed, "Oh my God." He seemed to want to run away, but luckily Tian caught him in time. "Please tell me more clearly. How harmful is it?" The old man collapsed completely. His body cringed, his voice became a whisper. "It's only because I love my grandchild so much and see him suffer that pitiful situation that I can't bear it, but I don't want another person's life to die unjustly. He alone is enough. What do you not understand?" Suddenly he pointed at Tian and said, "You are the next person." Tian was bewildered. Grandchildren? But what to do next? To die? The answer was very clear, but Tian thought he heard wrong. "Uncle said." Without letting Tian say more, the old man said in one breath, "Yan Vy was harmed and died unjustly. Its soul wandered without a place to rely on, so we had to always follow it and raise it from place to place. We just wanted to have something to eat and a face so we wouldn't have to make the ghost hungry. But we also did not expect that the soul's wanderings had a purpose. It wanted to seek revenge. It wants revenge on the Don family. So has she done it yet?" Pointing to Tian again. "See you, it's you." Tian rolled his eyes. "Why me?" the old man sighed. "It could be a mistake. Yan Vy told me to look for a member of the Don family, a man. When I saw him appear in that house after more than 20 years without anyone living, I thought he was the person my nephew was looking for, so I met you and told you to come here to let Yan Vy interact and..." Suddenly understanding, Tian smacked his lips. "I was misunderstood. But I think, eventually she will remember, she can't bear to harm me." The old man sighed again. "It's too late. After you and he had a physical relationship, it was too late." Tian was startled. "I didn't expect, besides, it was she who took the initiative." The old man nodded. "Of course it's because he wants to. But do you want to know why it does that?" He paused for a moment then continued. "Its ghost came back to tell us that it wanted to be reincarnated as soon as possible in another life but couldn't. Because in the underworld, only those who die normally, die due to old age or illness, are allowed to die soon. As for people like him, he has to find someone to take his life before he can leave. He chose the Don family because that family had an eternal grudge against him. They raped it, killed it, and let it drift down this waterfall. It's him." The old man seemed to have no strength to speak anymore. Then suddenly he stood up, limping but still trying to walk. "Tian is afraid. So what should I do?" he echoed. "Let me try. You meet me upstairs, floor." He could only say that much and then he was almost exhausted and fell down on the rock. Tian panicked and ran to help him up. "Hey uncle, are you okay?" The old man did not move anymore. His eyes were closed like a dead person. Tian was so scared that he didn't have time to think anymore, so he picked him up and ran away to the nearby residential area. While running, someone suddenly noticed and shouted, "The old man is wandering here." Tian stopped and asked, "Do you know this old man?" The other woman replied, "I know. He was a lonely old man, had no relatives, didn't know where his house was, but returned to this neighborhood and lived in an abandoned house near the cemetery over there. What's wrong with the old man? He fainted outside the waterfall, I accidentally." The other sister said, "If you'd like to please take him home. This abandoned house is often called a ghost house, near the cemetery." Having finished speaking, She left immediately. Tian had to carry the old man forward. Fortunately, the house called the ghost house was not far away, so before he was exhausted, Tian was able to bring the old man into the house. After a boy driving a cart passed by, he determined that the old man lived here. As soon as he looked up after placing the old man down on the bamboo cot, Tian was startled and exclaimed. Girl, he saw in the corner of the house an altar, on which was a framed bust of a girl. As soon as he saw Tian, he exclaimed. Yen vy. Tian's cry was very soft, almost as if only he could hear it, but for some reason it made the photo frame fall to the ground and break. Panicked, Tian quickly bent down to pick it up. In his haste, one of his fingers was cut quite deeply. Tian tried to suppress the pain to pick up the photo. At this time, one side of the glass frame was broken, revealing a corner of the photo that was blurred by a drop of blood. By natural reaction, Tian touched it again as if to stop the blood from spreading more on the photo. But Tian's actions caused the blood stain to spread wider. Suddenly it spread to his forehead and eyes. For some reason, the blood suddenly flowed down the corners of the photo's eyes and formed two blood-red tears. Oh my God! Tian is not surprised but afraid. He called softly. Miss Yen Vy, I'm sorry. He was about to say more, but at that moment, whether he was too emotional or his hands were shaking from blood loss, Tian let the photo frame fall again. But this time it didn't break. On the contrary, as soon as it hit the ground, it naturally flew back up and stood in its original position. Tian clasped his hands together and prayed very sincerely. I'm sorry for offending you. My heart doesn't want to. Before Tian finished speaking, he immediately received a slap in the face, but he didn't see who was slapping him, wanting to scream, but at that moment Tian suddenly looked into the girl's eyes. Behind the color of blood it seemed like her eyes were shaking. He remained silent, stepping back as if trying to find a way to escape. Suddenly, behind Tian, someone spoke. Saving people is important, why leave them lying there? Turning around, I saw no one, only the old man lying there as still as death. Tian did not dare to hesitate. He intended to go out to find a bottle of oil, but to his surprise, he saw someone had left a bottle of oil and a glass of hot milk right next to the old man. Tian rubbed the oil, and after a while the old man woke up. As soon as he saw him, he said softly, "You escaped the first step. But it's better to go. You should leave this place as soon as possible." I'm sorry. Tian still has no questions. But what are you sorry about? I mistook you, I thought you were a child of the Don family. For him to fall into this situation was unexpected. Seeing the blood on Tian's finger, the old man panicked and said, "Who made you bleed?" "Yes, just now I accidentally dropped the picture frame on the altar, the broken glass hit me." The old man sat up and looked at the blood-soaked photo. He exclaimed, "You need to go now, otherwise you won't be able to make it." Tian was surprised. "What's going on, bro? Your blood has penetrated its ghost, then you enter it, it will." When he said that, he almost choked, as if someone was strangling him. Tian had to ask loudly, "How are you doing?" The old man was almost tongue-tied. Go now. Don't you?" He quickly pulled Tian down, causing him to lose his balance and fall on top of his body. He suddenly heard a very soft voice from the old man's mouth. "Okay, I repay your debt. I die so you can live." Then he fell silent, his hands down. Tian panicked. "Uncle." He reached out to touch the old man's nose and discovered that he had stopped breathing. After returning from Bao Loc, Tian was sick for nearly 2 weeks. His body was hot and cold, and every time he closed his eyes it was like he heard someone calling his name. Tian had to take sedatives continuously for that condition to end. But there are things that Tian cannot understand, that is, every time his mother mentions the wedding day, he hears sobbing somewhere very close but does not know who it is. That's why this morning, when he saw his mother entering the room, Tian had to speak first. "I know, today I have to go to Du Huang's house to take care of the wedding. Mom, don't say anything, let me prepare." Tian silently prepared, changed clothes, brought the bride price himself, then signaled his mother to come with him without daring to say anything. Just like that, it's quiet. Until the conversation took place between the two families, a surprise happened. Sister Duhan ran out and told her mother. Du Huang suddenly got a fever, pulled her hair and screamed loudly in the room. Mrs. Hai Fan ran in immediately in fear. As soon as she saw her mother, Du Huang hugged her and continued to cry. "Mrs. Fan is afraid. Tell me what's wrong with you, don't scare me. There is a mother-in-law, children and a husband." When she said that, Huang shouted loudly. "Send him back. Tell him to go away." Tian's mother, Mrs. Nam, was also outside. She quickly spoke up. "I'm here, my son. Tian is sick but I'm trying to come here. If I'm very sick, let him take me to see a doctor." Du Huang shouted loudly. "Everyone go away, I'm afraid of you." Mrs. Fan was disappointed. "How are you, Huang?" She looked to Tian for help. "What do you think is wrong with it?" Tian grabbed Du Huang's hand and suddenly he cried out. "What's wrong with your hand?" A cold feeling like ice was running through Tian's body, and at the same time he was pushed back several meters away. Both mothers exclaimed. "What's up?" Mrs. Nam was able to catch her child, but had to let go immediately, because the cold air transmitted from Tian's body made her scream. "How are you, Tian?" Tian was looking at Du Huang in bewilderment when she spoke. "You guys get out of here now." Even her mother, Huang, also chased her away. "She also comes out?" "I said go." Looking at her child with concern, Mrs. Fan had no choice but to pull her husband's hand outside. Her voice trembled. "Dear God, please give my child peace." Then she almost begged Tian. "Is there any way I can help you? I'm so scared." Tian had a somewhat strange premonition, he muttered. "Maybe." Then he said privately to his mother. "Mom will wait for you on the line for a moment." He quickly walked out to Mrs. Fan's surprise. "Where is it going, sister?" Mrs. Nam shook her head. "I don't know either." Tian walked quickly towards the front. The road was completely unfamiliar, but it was as if someone had guided him, so he walked without any hesitation. Moments later, stopping next to a big tree, looking down at a small shrine under the tree, Tian bent down and picked up someone's handkerchief, then quickly put it in his pocket and walked quickly back into the house. Entering the house to the surprise of the two mothers. "Where are you going?" Tian did not answer, he went straight into the room where Du Huang was lying. Seeing her eyes closed as if she were sleeping, Tian gently placed the towel on her face, then walked out of the room without saying a word. About 5 minutes later, Du Huang suddenly walked out from inside, her face normal and bright as if nothing had happened. Mrs. Fan was surprised. "Is this you, Huang?" She smiled brightly. "But who do you think I am?" Suddenly seeing the handkerchief her child was holding, Mrs. Fan was even more surprised. "Is this the towel that you shouted so loudly this morning that you were going to dry it and then lost it?" Du Huang replied calmly. "Mr. Tian just brought it home for me." Mrs. Nam asked her child. Where did you get it? Tian replied. Where people deliberately hide it? Mrs. Fan was surprised. Who hid it? Before Tian could answer, Liu Huang said. Thank you for returning the animal I thought was lost. Then, as if nothing had happened, she turned to her mother. Why haven't you taken care of your child's wedding yet? Mrs. Fan was indescribably happy. You really aren't, like before, right? You scared me so much. Liu Huang urged. Tomorrow is the wedding reception, why are you still there talking nonsense? Are you okay? Mrs. Nam leaned close to her ear and whispered to Mrs. Sui. Maybe it was possessed by something earlier, but now it's probably gone. Thank you, superiors. She asked Tian softly. What did you do to make him wake up? Tian shook his head. I don't know. I'm just going to get what she lost and bring it back. How do you know where the scarf is hidden? Tian still shook his head. I don't know either. But actually Tian didn't know at all, because he acted as if he was being ordered by someone. It wasn't until the two of them stood alone in a corner of the yard that Liu Huang whispered to him. If you're a little late, tomorrow's wedding will be cancelled. Huang's voice sounds a bit strange, but it's hard for anyone besides Tian to understand. Mrs. Fan continued to discuss with her husband the bride's procession tomorrow. As I have calculated, tomorrow when your side comes over, this side will bring about 20 people with them. But the difficulty for my side is that right now my uncle Liu Huang, who will help officiate the wedding, was supposed to come yesterday, but up to now he still hasn't arrived. So if he's still not there at the last minute, he'll probably have to ask someone else. Unfortunately, Huang refused to ask anyone from her family to be here, she only asked for her uncle. I'm worried. Just then, a person walked in from outside the door, and upon seeing Mrs. Fan, he shouted. Mr. Tu, waiting for you to grow your neck, why are you coming over now? An old man surprised not only Mrs. Fan, his appearance made Tian's eyes widen and frightened. Hey, why you? That was Yan Vy's grandfather, who died when Tian fell on him at Dambri. Tian himself personally buried him before returning, so why is he here now? And he didn't hear what the old man said, so he asked again. Why are you alive? The old man was bewildered. Who are you? But why am I not alive? Both questions and answers made the two mothers bewildered. What are you saying, Tian? Are you familiar with Mr. Tu? Tian did not answer his mother-in-law's question, but turned to ask the old man. You really don't miss me? I myself was at Dambri, buried. The old man turned to Mrs. Fan. Is this guy Liu Huang's husband and children? What does it say that I don't understand? Tian suspected he didn't remember, so he tried to say. You are Yan Vy's grandfather. It was you who. As soon as he said that, Tian choked, as if someone was blocking his throat. He tried to continue speaking, but the more he tried, the more he felt like he was suffocating. Meanwhile, the old man's voice remained calm. Young men are already confused at this age. I've never met him before and I'm not in Dambri or something, but he keeps insisting. Mrs. Nam must remind her child. I must have mistaken you for someone else. From that moment on, Tian was like someone who had lost his soul. Sitting and talking, he kept glancing at the old man from time to time, causing Liu Huang to say to him privately. Pay attention to what to do about that. Let's go back and keep going. I picked some fruit and sent it home to my grandchildren at home. Tian followed her out but still couldn't stop wondering about the old man. After a while, he couldn't stop and had to say. You can't be mistaken, he is. Once again, his throat felt tight and Tian's mind was spinning. He heard a cry ringing in his ears again. After the morning of bringing the bride home, While the whole family was happily partying, Uncle Tu, the old man that Tien mistook for Yen Vy's grandfather, suddenly disappeared. After the party, Mrs. Fan waited for a long time before returning, after texting Tien. Maybe he's old and still drinks a lot, so he went somewhere and got lost. If you ever come home, I'll ask someone to take you home for me. Tien could not understand this strange person, so he assured his wife. I'm sure there's something unusual about this guy. Yu Huang is still indifferent. Leave him alone. Now I worry about myself. I want to go to bed very early and remember to tell my mom and family not to wake me up before 9 o'clock the next morning. Tien was bewildered. If you sleep until that hour, do you want your mother to scold you? A new daughter-in-law must wake up early to her husband's house. Yu Huang is still calm. This daughter-in-law is different. Having finished speaking, she immediately went into the room even though the party was still going on. Mrs. Nam saw it, but felt sorry for her child, so she smiled and told Tien. It's tired, let it rest. I understand. She also added. After what happened this morning, I knew she wasn't completely healthy yet, but she still tried, poor little girl. Tien didn't think so and quietly followed his wife into the room. Only half a minute after Du Huang, but when Tien arrived, she was already lying on the bed soundly asleep. Tried calling and shaking, but Huang still didn't know. Tien's wedding night would have been complete if at midnight that night he did not suddenly hear a whisper in his ear. After enjoying it, now you're bored and don't want it anymore, right? Startled, he tried to get up, but Tien was pulled back by his wife. Do you want to avoid responsibility? Hearing a voice that was familiar but different from Du Huang's, Tien panicked. She is, the person has already given himself to you, now you plan to deny it to usurp another person, right? At this point, Tien was no longer confused, he softly called out. Yen Vy. Not any Yen Vy. It's the ghost she asked to come here to collect her debt. Whatever you borrow, you have to pay back. Tien was about to get up when she shouted. Be still. Tien worries. Where is Du Huang? The voice in his ear was sharp. If you mention her name again, don't blame her. On your wedding night, if you know you're sleeping with a ghost, there's no scarier feeling. Therefore, Tien lay down stiffly, barely making any movement like a husband. But that was on his part, not hers. She took the initiative in everything, bringing Tien back to the feeling of losing blood like the night at Danbury, so much so that in the end Tien could only lie panting, his body exhausted. Early the next morning. It was not until after 9 o'clock that Mrs. Fan sent someone in to wake up Tien and his wife. But I keep calling but still don't hear anyone answer. Mrs. Fan herself had to call out. Wake up, guys, still silent. After calling 3 times, Mrs. Fan began to worry, pushed open the door and there was no Du Huang in the room, only Tien was lying half on the bed, the other half hanging on the floor, his face pale. With Mrs. Fan shouted loudly and rushed forward to touch Tien. His whole body was as cold as ice and he had almost no energy left. My son. Tien was taken out for emergency treatment, while the others ran to find Du Huang. That afternoon, people only found a pair of Huang's clogs lying on the riverbank near her house. Everyone thought that Du Huang had drowned, so they tried their best to search the nearby river. However, I searched all day and still got no results. Tien was revived after being rescued, but in a state like a lost soul. At noon the next day, someone at Mrs. Fan's house reported that Du Huang's body had been found lying dead at the base of an old tree, next to the ancient temple, where Tien had found the handkerchief the day before. He was exhausted, but as soon as he heard that, Tian jumped up and wanted to leave. When he arrived, Tian burst into tears when he saw his wife's body brought home and lying at home with her appearance still the same as when she was alive. Mrs. Fan cried and recounted. Mom was sleeping when she heard someone calling and crying outside. She opened the door and only saw a shadow running quickly. Looking at that shadow, my mother suddenly thought of Du Huang. Mom ran after him and eventually came to the ghost shrine, and saw his body lying there. She cried all her tears, while Tian was stunned. He muttered, "People have harmed me." Mrs. Fan couldn't hear clearly, so she asked again. Who harmed whom? Tian did not answer. He silently walked out and silently walked towards the Soul Temple. There's something mysterious that makes Tian think he can find it here. While still looking, Tian was startled when he discovered that on the wall inside the Temple of the Soul there were 2 lines of words written in red blood that had become dark brown over time. As soon as he saw the words Tian, his face turned pale, because it was exactly the same as the 2 verses on the cliff at Dambri waterfall. Once I loved someone, I couldn't forget them for 1,000 years. Half a honeymoon, a lifetime will be hard to forget. Yen Vy. Tian was dumbfounded. So he couldn't escape her. Yet when he crushed the old man to death that day, the old man himself said that he had escaped revenge, because he had sacrificed himself to save his life. So why is there still this revenge? Why is there this coincidence between this countryside and far away Dambri? Could it be that this place is Yen Vy's hometown and this temple is to worship her? Tian's mind became more and more confused. He stood hesitantly reading the 2 verses over and over without noticing someone was observing him for a long time, until that person asked, "What are you looking for there?" Looking up to see an old lady, Tian quickly said, "Ma'am, I find it strange because in the temple there are some verses. The old woman seems to know a lot about the abandoned temple. It only concerns other people. Why do you have to be curious?" That statement made Tian even more curious. "Who are you talking about? Why do you want to know?" "Yes, please tell me, I want to." The old woman turned away and said, "I haven't told anyone about this for a long time, but these past few days I've felt like I've almost lost my strength. I understand that I should tell someone about this temple, otherwise no one will know. Tell." Tian followed. He begged, "Please tell me, I need to know." Signaling for Tian to follow her to an old tile house nearby, when she got there she continued, "You are the first person to hear me say this, please come in." Tian obediently followed in. Once inside, he didn't have time to ask anything when he heard the old woman speak. "Which country are you from?" "Yes. I live in the commune across the river. I came here to be the son-in-law of Haifan's family." As soon as she heard that, the old woman opened her eyes wide. "Do you have a daughter who just died?" "Yes." "Died because of involvement with the Don family?" Tian panicked. "Do you know about that?" Not looking kindly, the old woman looked out the window, her voice sad. "I thought this incident had passed. Why is it happening again now? This is an unjust retribution." Tian tried to listen, but the old woman stopped talking for a long time before continuing. "I thought that if the Don family left, everything would be over, but when the temple of the ghosts was still there would still be resentment. Is the Don family in this country?" Pointing towards the temple of ghosts, she said. "That ancient banyan tree used to be their gate. That temple is the reason why they left home and have not heard any news until now." "Who left, then?" "The Don family. In the past, for more than 20 years, they were a tycoon in this area, with the largest house in the village. In addition, it was said that there were also a few vacation houses in remote places, because the owner, the Doan family, was a professional. Exploiting forest timber in the highlands brings great wealth. Tien is more curious. What does the Doan family's story of leaving the country have to do with that temple of ghosts? Yes. That temple was founded by the Doan family before they fled. Then, without waiting for Tien to ask, she continued. They built the temple because they were destroyed by evil spirits. It is said that they committed some crime with a virgin somewhere in the forest, and when they returned here, their unjust soul followed them back. At that time, I heard here that both children born to Boss Doan's wife had mysteriously died, making the wife so scared that she had to send away her third child, who had just been born in the city. Always, not knowing where they were going, until they left this village. People say that after that, the Doan family not only fled to another country but also changed their name. Perhaps thanks to that, since then, this place has no longer had the ghost of a girl appearing at the ghost temple to cry and demand her life. Yet now it happened that Haifan's daughter was murdered and her body was at that temple. Maybe. The old woman suddenly looked at Tien. Do you have anything to do with the Doan family? Tien panicked. No. Duong's nephew. Strange. The old woman said the words and then fell silent. It seemed like she was thinking about something. After a while, she suddenly asked. How do you know Ms. Haifan's family and marry her daughter? Yes, because my mother knows me. Previously, I heard that your mother lived in this country. What's your mother's name? Yes, people often call her Mrs. Nam. Is it Nam Huang? Hearing her question, Tien was startled, because the name Huang is his mother's customary name that he has rarely heard anyone call for a long time. He was confused. Grandma, you know my mother. The horny old woman looked at Tien feverishly. Could it be that you are? Without finishing her sentence, she stood up. Suddenly asked. Are you Dongjung's son? Tien shook his head. No. My father is Duong Hoa. After Tien's answer, the old woman relaxed. So it's not true, but you go back and ask your mother if she knows Mr. Dongjung. And are you the old Nam Huang, the daughter of business owner Loyan Kin? Though although the tension was relieved, the old lady still did not stop looking at Tien with curious eyes. Why is your mother Nam Huang? Tien shook his head. I don't know either. The old woman muttered to herself. Couldn't this be? Then, perhaps because she had been sitting a lot and talking a lot, the old woman gently shook her head and told Tien. Well, that's enough what you know. If you're not from the Doan family, I advise you not to be curious about that temple. There have been so many troubles surrounding it, and this village no longer wants any more unjust deaths to happen. Well, you go home. Tell me to send my condolences to Mrs. Haifan. After she finished speaking, she quietly went inside, leaving Tien with her questions. After burying his wife, Tien returned home immediately. And the first thing he did was ask his mother. Were you in Kendo before your grandfather is the owner of Loy business? Even though he was surprised, Nam still gently replied. Right. What are you asking? Because I have rarely had the opportunity to ask about my family for a long time. Because since I was young, I have been away from home, living in France, so I have never had a chance to. Tien suddenly asked. Why did I have to leave home when I was so small? That question made Mrs. Nam stare at her son, then after a moment she replied. My siblings were difficult to raise, so my mother had to send me to Uncle Sao in France to raise. What do you mean when you say I'm difficult to raise? Were you very sick when you were born? Mrs. Nam shook her head. Are not. On the contrary, when the child was born, he weighed over 3 kilograms and was very plump. His mother planned to keep it, but his father decided not to let him. Also because the two siblings had previously. She stopped talking, but Tian suddenly asked. Did all your siblings die right after birth? Mrs. Nam looked at her child in surprise. How do you know? So is that true? But why haven't you heard me say it for a long time if you don't ask someone to tell you? Then suddenly Tian asked. What is my real name? Mrs. Nam was clearly panicked. What are you asking for? But you haven't answered me yet. Are you really named Duong, or is it surnamed Don? This question made Mrs. Nam tremble and immediately change her expression. You don't ask. Tian is the one panicking at this moment. He said with a trembling voice. So it really is the Don family. Then like a fallen tree trunk, Tian fell down and sat on the floor before Mrs. Nam's panic. Hey, what's wrong? Tian said like a psychopath. So you are a member of the Don family. My father is Dongjung, not Duonghoa, right? Mrs. Nam is like a deflated balloon. I know everything, there's no need to ask me anymore. A silence that made it difficult to breathe. After a while Tian sighed. It's right that you accept the consequences. Why do you force your wife to die? Oh my God. Mrs. Nam stammered. That old story is over. Your father is also dead. It's been more than 20 years, but clearly it's not over yet. Do you know who died because of Du Huang? Because of the unjust soul of a girl named Yen Vy. As soon as she heard that name, Mrs. Nam screamed. How do you know that name? Why do you not only know but also meet? And he was silent, then later burst into tears. Mrs. Nam is scared. What's the matter, child? I think this is something your father did in the past. But everyone has their own fault, right? Besides, I haven't seen her spirit return for a long time, have I, Mom? Do you know these two verses? A time when you love someone for 1,000 years and you can't forget them, half a honeymoon is hard to forget for a lifetime. Mrs. Nam completely collapsed. So I understand everything. She collapsed, covering her face, crying. Tian calmed down. I want to know more about our family, don't hide it from me anymore. Mrs. Nam cried for a while, then suddenly looked up and asked. Who told you all this? I met her myself. Where? At Dambri waterfall. Oh my God. Mrs. Nam cried out like that and then cried again. After a long time, she said through tears. Your father's crime happened up there, that's right? Mom, tell me everything. Mrs. Nam suddenly stood up, then instead of going into her own room, she went out to the side of the house. Tian followed and asked his mother. Where are you going, Mom? Holding a spade to dig the ground on the side of the house, Mrs. Nam went straight to the base of the largest jackfruit tree in the garden and told her child. Mom can't dig it up, help her dig it up. Tian was surprised. What's underneath? All the truths you want to know. Tian dug with each stroke of the spade, but his heart was confused. Moments later, he discovered a small iron chest lying deep in the soil. A little surprised, Mrs. Nam said. I took it up, there was no money in it, only a notebook that my mother burned, but after burning it 5 or 7 times it still wouldn't burn, so I had to bury it, hoping time would destroy it. Opening the iron chest, there was indeed only one rather old hardcover book inside. Before Tian dared to pick it up, Mrs. Nam reminded him. Just take your own precautions and read. After reading it, you can destroy it or bury it if you want. Mom is so scared of it. She turned and left. Tian held the notebook for a long time before walking back to his room. Even though he was quite tired after everything from morning until now, Tian still tried to open the notebook and read voraciously. Day, month, year. Actually, I didn't go to Blau today. But perhaps it was fate that I suddenly turned around from Guyana through the shortcut and met her. The girl of both kin and Thuong bloodlines is so incredibly beautiful. When I asked her what her name was, she simply replied, Yen Vy. I explain myself. Yen Vy is the tail of a swallow. But the swallow or bird's nest has the most charm and beauty in its wagging tail. She smiled widely and then suddenly asked herself, "Do you want to raise this swallow in a cage while spontaneous?" I quickly replied. I want it so much. So within just a short meeting, Yen Vy and I fell in love. But there is nothing wrong, because I am an unmarried boy and she is an unmarried girl, both have the right to be together and love each other. 2 months after I became Blau again, I came to a rather surprising decision for her. I will build a house and stay here to start a business. Yen Vy was surprised and didn't believe it. There is no business here of yours, why did you decide to stay? I smiled and replied. Why not? That solid foundation is you. I will marry you and we will build a family here, right near this waterfall. He has been to Kamli Waterfall, Pren Waterfall, Pongur, but only found this place to be the most beautiful. Maybe because of you. So I associated my life with the land, with the beautiful Dambri Waterfall. The love story, as beautiful as a painting, began with a promise between the two of us beside the roaring waterfall. I promised her. For the rest of my life, I only have you. Even if things change and stars move, there is still only one name, Yen Vy, in Dongjung's life. She also solemnly promised in the afternoon the sunset over the waterfall. In this life, if heaven exists and earth exists, then Yen Vy's love for Chung will forever exist. If you say the wrong thing, heaven and earth will be destroyed. I was startled by that heavy oath, but what do I know when her love for me was already so deep in that moment? And I also had to swear again for her to believe. I vow to be with you all my life. If I break my promise, I will have to pay with my entire future. Day, month, year. So the two of them fulfilled their wish. Although their parents heard the news from their hometown, they objected to the love affair, which they considered contradictory and inappropriate, because according to them, kin people could not become husband and wife with a Thuong girl. Yen Vy's family also objected. They think that their love for Yen Vy is not real, they suspect. There is only one person, her grandfather, who always supports her, but he does not have much influence in the family. So in the end we chose to decide our future by getting married without both parents witnessing. Thanks to Yen Vy's learning of the kin language, she understood the rules of kin people's lifestyle, so when the two of them lived together in the house they had just built, near an area where kin people lived, no one knew who she was. Ethnic. The name Yen Vy is a completely Vietnamese name that she gave herself when she went to kin school, not Th Rias Chowro ethnic name. She said that from now on she only wants to be called Yen Vy. Day, month, year. Unexpectedly, the accident happened to the two of them so early. Coming from my family again, when they heard that I was building a separate house with Yen Vy, my parents went all the way to find her and firmly objected, forcing me to leave her immediately. If I didn't listen, my father took a strong hand and cut off all sources of money that had long given me to trade in wood and forest products. This wouldn't be a problem, if it weren't for the fact that my father organized the kidnapping of Yen Vy and hid it for more than a month, driving me crazy, searching everywhere. In the end, I was able to free Yen Vy, but when I returned, she suddenly became sick and was almost mute and crazy. I tried every way to cure her, but it was ineffective, because later I learned that my father had asked a witch doctor to give Yen Vy some kind of medicine that he said would make the person drink it. You will lose all memory of what happened before. It means forcing her to forget herself. Day, month, year. Seeing that I still refused to leave her, my father took stronger action. He spread the news, accusing her of being a half-ghost girl. With the help of an unscrupulous witch doctor, Yen Vy was shunned and chased away by people in the village. Even the people in the Kin neighborhood near the house he built for her to live in hated and boycotted, making Yen Vy even more crazy, and one day she disappeared without leaving any trace. I searched everywhere, even went to her village to look for more but still couldn't find her. 3 months have passed. Day, month, year. I returned to Danbury after several months of searching everywhere and was surprised to see the verses on the cliff. I immediately knew it was written by Yen Vy herself, which broke my heart even more. I stayed on that cliff for 3 days and nights, hoping to see her, but there was still no news. Until one afternoon, I heard the news of lightning. There was a dead body floating downstream of the waterfall. It was a woman. When I got there, it was Yen Vy's body. I brought her body home and planned to bury it right in the garden, but her body suddenly disappeared at midnight that night. Day, month, year. Tien put down the diary and exclaimed in surprise, "Oh my God!" Then he sat stiffly. How could he have imagined that the story would end up like this? Luckily, when Yen Vy's ghost met him for the first time, she just wanted revenge, so she sucked his blood, not doing anything dirty. Tien turned back and asked his mother, "Did Mom get to know Dad at that time?" Mrs. Nam shook her head. "Maybe not yet. When he was disturbed by that incident, he ran away from home for nearly a year before returning home in a state of complete disarray. My grandfather took that opportunity to ask my mother to marry him. At first he refused, but in the end perhaps he was too fed up with the gangster story, so he agreed. Mom is a country girl and knows nothing but obeying her parents. After living with my father for 2 years, my mother gave birth to my first child. Mom was very happy, but before she could be completely happy, one late night, while she was breastfeeding her baby, suddenly a figure with messy hair and a wet body rushed in from outside the window and snatched the baby in my mother's hand and ran away. Mom screamed and cried, but when everyone ran in, no one knew where to look that morning. My father himself found my sister's body lying dead at the mouth of the well next to the ancient banyan tree in front of the house. "Looks like your sister's body was just picked up from the well." She had to stop several times because emotions interrupted her words. After a while, he continued, "2 years later, it's your turn." It had just been born, and while it was still lying in the hands of the midwife, it was taken away again, also by a white shadow with loose hair. And then the boy's body was also found at the well like last time. This time even more daring, the murderer loudly announced that he would continue to kill any baby born in the Doan family. Tien couldn't stop and quickly interjected. "Who is that?" Mrs. Nam said with tears in her eyes. My father immediately knew it was Yen Vy. It was her unjust soul that sat under the old tree for several nights afterward. Therefore, when my mother was pregnant with me, my father, not wanting to lose my child, decided to move to another place. Then after my mother gave birth, my father immediately decided to send me to Uncle Sao in France to raise him. Then, following the advice of a teacher, my father changed his name, cut off his past, left his hometown and never returned to the places where he had lived before. Tien interrupted. "But why didn't you stop me when I returned to my country and intended to go to Bao Loc?" Mrs. Nam shook her head. "Mom, I'm going up there. Tien recalls that when he intended to find a quiet place to write his doctoral thesis that he would return to France to submit after getting married, a relative silently gave him the address in Dambry. Tien also didn't remember who it was. He asked his mother, "Who brought the car to Bao Loc the other day? Do you remember?" Mrs. Nam shook her head again. "I thought it was your friend from France who came back with you." Tien said. "Which child has friends that age?" He himself claimed to be a relative of his family, volunteered to take his child to Bao Loc and even showed the house that he said was his empty house, intending to let his child stay for free for a long time. Mrs. Nam exclaimed, "I have been guided by its ghost. Since my father died, my mother left that house, never mentioning it, and I don't know what happened to it anymore." Tien mumbled, "My last name is Duong, so how can the unjust soul of Miss Yen Vy know that my last name is Don?" Mrs. Nam suddenly understood. "It's just because I'm subjective. Mom thought it must have been too long, and in the past few decades, she hasn't seen her ghost haunt her anymore, so when she heard Mrs. Hai Fan offered to marry you, she quickly took you over there to meet her. But forget that. That old place is where there is still a temple of ghosts that my mother asked people to build to worship the unjust soul of Ms. Yen Vy. Perhaps her ghost's revenge is not over yet." After finishing her story, she whispered to her child, "This bad diary, Mom tried to burn it many times, but never succeeded. Even if I put it in the furnace, it still wouldn't burn, so I buried it. Now try burning it again. If it works, consider destroying it." Tien followed. He lit a fire in the garden and threw the diary into it himself. "I thought it wouldn't burn like my mother said." However, unexpectedly, the notebook burst into flames. The flame was higher than usual and emitted strange black smoke. A few minutes later, there was nothing left. Mrs. Nam herself was also surprised. "So what?" Tien said softly. "Maybe everything has been resolved. Diu Huang died for her child and the unjust soul of Ms. Yen Vy was satisfied and stopped pursuing. Degree. That afternoon, Tien himself returned to his wife's house. He lit incense to worship Diu Huang and sobbed in front of the altar. "It was I who killed you and you gave me life, Huang. I live wisely and spiritually, please bless me to stay here with me and live the yin and yang situation of separation but not separation. I would like to stay with you forever in this house." He asked his mother-in-law's permission to live in the room where Diu Huang lived. Although Ms. Hai Fan did not want to, she still pleased Tien. From that day on, Tien played the role of a hard-working, diligent, and exemplary son-in-law. To the surprise of many people, Tien alone went to the temple to clean and paint it to make it spacious and clean. He prayed very sincerely. "Miss Yen Vy already knows, I won't hide it anymore, I am the blood of the Don family. I understand what my ancestors did in the past, it was an unforgivable sin and your search for revenge is justifiable. I don't blame you at all, I only blame the innocent girl who died for me. But you have to lose your life. We hope you will be compassionate and forgive us. From now on, I vow to be the servant of your soul and the guardian of your temple. If you accept, then let me live and do the promised mission. Otherwise, please let me die right here, right now." He knelt down and waited. But throughout the day, to the surprise of passers-by, Tien remained calm. When he finished the absolution, the three monks stood up and the temple suddenly caught fire. Tianqin panicked and tried to rush in to fix it, but he couldn't do it in time, because the fire just broke out and completely burned down the nearly 30-year-old temple. Tien mumbled, "It's really over. Thank you and pray that Ms. Yen Vy's soul will soon recover." From that day on, Tien lived peacefully with his wife's family and did not hide that he was a person with the surname Don. Leaving the hair salon, Ngoc Ha had to hold the hat tightly on her head. Even though there was no wind, she still didn't dare let go, just because, the hair on her head now, if anyone saw it, Ha would probably commit suicide. An accident falling from the sky yesterday caused Ngoc Ha to have an entire bucket of paint that fell from a few house repair workers all over her head, and Ha could only feel the pain of having that paint all over her hair. Long and smooth has always been her pride. After diligently using oil and many other methods, Ngoc Ha did not dare to look at her face in the mirror, because her hair was now only a messy, shaggy mess. So much so that this morning Ha had to cover her head and go to the hair salon near her house to ask for help. However, after nearly 2 hours of trying, the shop's main mechanic could only do part of the job. The original hair was saved, but had to be cut short in pieces, making it look as messy as a field that had been plowed carelessly. "Oh, it's Ha. Where are you going? It's already dark at this hour and you're still wearing your hat." Looking back to see her mother's aunt and cousin, Ngoc Ha was relieved, because she was afraid of meeting strangers. "Yes. I'm going to curl my hair." Aunt Hai whispered. "Your hair is the most beautiful in this village, why are you curling it for nothing?" Seeing Ha hesitate, Aunt Hai suddenly remembered. "Ah, was it the paint spill this morning Auntie forgot?" Then she asked quickly. "Do you want to wear a wig?" Ngoc Ha looked at her aunt in shock. "Is the wig bought at the store?" Ms. Ha Dung pulled Ha's hand. "Come by Auntie, I have beautiful hair." Ngoc Ha reluctantly followed her aunt. When entering the house, Mrs. Dung ran into the room, took out an old but clean paper box, and gave it to Ha. "When I was young, I once wanted long hair, so I wished to have a borrowed head of hair, and I got my wish when my lover, a French teacher, gave me this head of hair. This is a wig from a large Western hairdressing salon, so I'm not afraid of my friend's bad or sick hair." But then she got married and didn't need it, so from then on she's been in the closet. Never used yet. Ngoc Ha originally did not like using wigs, especially other people's hair, but now, in this situation, she had to take out the hair box to take a look. As soon as she saw her hair as long as her old hair, she exclaimed, "So beautiful." Aunt Dung sincerely. "Let me give it to you, just put it on while your hair comes back out." She also reassured, "This is expensive hair, from a big salon, so rest assured, it's not the hair of a dead person." She also dug out the bottom of the box, took out a piece of paper and gave it to Ha. "This is a commitment letter from the hair salon. They clearly state that this hair belongs to a 20-year-old girl. After getting married, her husband didn't like long hair at home, so she asked the salon to cut it short for her and give it to her as a gift. For the shop." Ha read through the paper and then seemed satisfied. She said, "Auntie, give me." Aunt Dung excitedly said, "Having someone use something I like is something I'm very happy about. So do you need to wear it now? I know how to make a wig, let me do it for you." Ha nodded immediately. "Yes, I thank you." Aunt Dung is a skillful person, so after half an hour, the wig was harmoniously connected to the remaining hair on her head. When looking in the mirror, Ha herself was also very surprised. "Just like the real thing, Auntie Ha." Looking at her niece, Aunt Dung was also very satisfied. "It's true that this is just for you." Coming home that evening, Mrs. Tu Le, Ha's mother, was also surprised at her daughter's cheerfulness, different from when her hair was in trouble. After seeing the wig, she had to exclaim, "Look at me like a princess." Ngoc Ha touched her mother's shoulder and said very softly. Doesn't that mean postponing the wedding? Ms. Ellie was excited. It has relieved my mother's worries from this morning until now. Fortunately, my mother had not informed the other party about the request to postpone the wedding date. Okay, tomorrow morning we will personally go to Tuan's house to discuss more about the wedding. Tuan's fear of seeing her with a mangled head had now disappeared, so that night Ngoc Ha slept soundly until midnight. Before going to sleep, Ha had to take off her wig and hang it carefully on high, so when she woke up she had to get out of bed to check. After looking at it, when she went back to bed to sleep, Ha didn't dare look at her face in the mirror, because she knew that if she looked at it now, she would definitely be very disappointed. But after only lying in bed for about half an hour, Ha woke up again. Looking at the wall clock, it was only 2 in the morning. Ha didn't want to continue sleeping, so she tinkered with her wig and, imitating ant dung, she covered it herself and meticulously attached it. Although it took longer than her aunt, Ha finally finished it. That will help her from now on not have to bother ant dung anymore. At least it should be like that. Ngoc Ha plans to leave her hair like that until morning. However, after only more than 10 minutes, her eyelids became heavy, the sleepiness made Ha unable to resist, even though it was more than 3 o'clock. Ha! It's noon, wake up so you can go. Hearing her mother's call twice before Ha woke up, she was startled to see the clock showing 9 o'clock. Why didn't you call me sooner? Mrs. Le called in from outside. She complained of a sore throat but she didn't listen. Tomorrow when I go back to my husband's house and sleep like that, my mother-in-law will curse me. Ha walked over to the makeup mirror. As soon as she looked in the mirror, she screamed. Oh my God! Mrs. Le ran in from outside, panicking. What's going on, child? Then she herself had to scream. Oh my God! In front of her, her beloved daughter was looking like a devil. Her face is pale green, her long hair stands up like a broom. What's wrong with you? Mrs. Le asked and wanted to back away. Is it you, Ha, with? Mrs. Le trembled to the point of falling, while Ngoc Ha was almost paralyzed. She stammered speechlessly. What's going on? What's going on? Then Ha's eyes turned dark, she fell forward, degree. At that time, there was no one in the house except mother and child, so when they both woke up, they looked at each other in bewilderment. Then Ha asked. What's wrong with me, Mom? Mrs. Le looked at her daughter and was happy. Oh, I don't have anything. Ha's face has now returned to normal. When she looked in the mirror, she was also surprised. What's wrong with my face, Mom? Ms. Le still hasn't stopped shaking. Just now, but I was dizzy. Ha also said. Maybe you have insomnia and worry. Remembering the ghost's face last night, Ha was still skeptical, so she examined her face in the mirror for a long time, until Mrs. Le reminded her. Even though it's late, I've already gone there, I have to go now. Ngoc Ha applied more makeup because she was afraid of appearing haggard in front of her lover. Especially she is still haunted by her devil-like face. Once they reached the street, Ha quietly asked her mother. Mom, do you see anything unusual on my face? Mrs. Le smiled brightly. Still enough to captivate Tuan. Stroking her child's wig, she praised. It's even smoother than my old hair. They went to Tuan's house. While he had not returned from going to the market, Mrs. Suang, Tuan's mother, told the story without regaining composure at that time. There was a ghost in this house last night? Mrs. Le was surprised. How are ghosts? It's strange that Tuan met a ghost. I was sleeping in the middle of the night when I heard him scream. When I ran over to wake him up, he pointed out the window and shouted. I asked him what he saw. He said there was a girl who kept asking him to go with her. Then she lowered her voice. Listening to Tuan, that girl had long hair, but her face was sometimes beautiful like a fairy, sometimes like a yaksha. Since morning, he still hasn't recovered, so he had to go to the doctor to get medicine and hasn't returned yet. As soon as she heard that, Ngocha suddenly trembled and asked again. What time did Mr. Tuan see that nightmare? It's past midnight, it seems like it's after 3 in the morning or something. Mrs. Le suddenly exclaimed. Right on time. Mrs. Suang was surprised. What do you mean on time? Ngocha blurted out for her mother. At that time, I also encountered something strange. Mrs. Suang just looked at Ha and was about to ask, when Tuan walked in from outside. The guy stopped immediately and stared at Ngocha, with a shocked expression. Could it be me? Everyone was stunned, while Ha was surprised. You tell me Tuan did not take his eyes off Ha, he stammered. That's right, that's right. Then he shouted loudly. It's me. Then he stepped closer, grabbed Ha's shoulder and shook her vigorously. You came into my room last night, right at this moment. Mrs. Le could not bear it anymore, she shouted. Hey, she is my daughter, no one is allowed to speak ill of her. It's your business what ghosts you see, but my daughter was at home with me all night last night, and just came here. Mrs. Suang also chimed in. Don't let the chicken turn into a hoe. Please calm down. Tuan still looked at Ha like he was looking at a stranger. It took a while for him to pull out a chair and sit down and calm down. I'm sorry Mom, I'm sorry Ha. Just because last night was a nightmare that I had for the first time. Then Tuan turned to speak softly to Ha. In the middle of the night, I suddenly felt like someone was calling my name. When I opened my eyes, I saw a figure exactly like you standing right at the window. He was just about to call out when the person suddenly turned to look, and he wanted to have a heart attack because of her demonic face. He had never seen a face like that, so for a moment he was almost speechless and couldn't make a sound. Until he regained his composure, he was about to open his mouth to scream when suddenly that person looked at him and smiled, and his face became gentle again, as beautiful as an angel. Sometimes she's as beautiful as you, and has your features. Tuan squeezed Ha's hand. Please excuse me. Ngocha said. I feel almost the same as you. Same face like a devil. She told the story from beginning to end. As soon as she heard it, Mrs. Suang exclaimed. So we both see it at once. Ms. Le also said. I also saw it with my own eyes. Tuan recounted the story of going to see a doctor. This doctor is very good, specializes in treating mental illness. After listening to him, he checked his pulse, then when he looked into his eyes, he said he was possessed by something. Ngocha was surprised. Western medical doctors don't believe in ghosts. Why is there ghosts here? This doctor also researches spirituality, so he said he cannot ignore this idealistic factor. He also told him that if he had a lover, he should bring her so he could look at her appearance. He could combine Western medicine and spirituality to find clues about this strange story. Although Ngocha was worried, she still wanted to hear what the doctor had to say, so she whispered to Tuan. Later, if possible, I'll take you there with me. Tuan knew that if he agreed, he would face opposition from his two mothers, so he only tacitly agreed with Ha. Later, after dinner time, he tried to invite Ha out. Mom, let me take Ha to look at some jewelry. The two mothers immediately agreed and said, you can go anywhere, as long as you remember to return before dark so you can get home in time. The doctor received Ha in the presence of Tuan. When he finished checking his pulse, he asked Ha to look into his eyes and suddenly he exclaimed, your vision is even more worrying than Mr. Tuan. This is my fiancé, doctor, please look carefully. The pulse is unstable, but what's more worrying is the look in his eyes, like he just went through something terrible. She said honestly, what just happened to her? Ha does not hide. Yes, last night I had the same nightmare as Tuan. It's just that the devilish image is my face. The doctor pondered for a moment, then opened a book in French, turned over a paragraph he marked with a red pen, and said, your case is almost similar to this one. In Europe there have been such phenomena, people call it being haunted, but our people simply call it ghost possession. Tuan asked. But why did the ghost enter both of us at the same time? It is not strange at all. When a ghost appears, it finds what we call the soul that best suits it to let that soul see. Souls are not existing objects, so it is possible for two people in two distant places to see them at the same time. Between the soul and the living soul, the living person communicates through the spiritual world, not reality. He reassured. However, don't worry too much. There will be nothing more to do, as long as you don't think about it anymore. Actually, what do these two people think about someone making them obsessed? Even Ngoc Ha still doesn't understand why she is like that. She asked Tuan. Have you met or been haunted by any girl? Tuan shook his head very decisively. There is none. When they returned home, it was a bit dark. Mrs. Suang commented. It's a busy night, and the way from here to the house is difficult, so maybe you and Ngoc Ha should just stay and sleep and Tuan will take you home early tomorrow morning. Mrs. Le wanted to agree, but Ha seemed restless. Maybe I'll ask permission to go home. It's not far from here, it only takes about half an hour to get there, and it's not too dark yet. Please allow me. Seeing that, Ms. Le also said. Okay, let my mother and I go home. Tomorrow morning, Ha still has to go measure her wedding dress. Only 1 week left. Mrs. Suang told Tuan. So I'll take the boat and follow, bringing Sister Sui and Ha home. I ask someone to go with me, so when I get back they can row for me. Tuan laughed. I can go alone, right? Why do you still need a bodyguard to bring your wife home? Last time, Ms. Le and her mother went by buggy, but now it's safer to go by boat, so she said to Tuan. Let's row slowly. I haven't been on a boat for a long time, so I want to see the river a bit. Tuan pointed to the shrimp tail machine. The boat runs on a motor, but I will run slowly to give you enough time to admire the scenery. Ngoc Ha chimed in. Only my mother looks at me, but where did my wife leave me? Yes, my wife also watched it. The wife was so worried about sightseeing that she forgot her husband had to drive the boat. Seeing the two of them joking together made Le satisfied. She looked at them with loving eyes. Thanks to that, the entire 5-kilometer journey passed quickly. Upon arriving, she told Tuan. Go home, drink water, rest for a while and then come back. Tuan quickly said. I have to go home or my mother will look after me. He took his mother-in-law up to her house, then got back on the boat and went home. When preparing to leave the boat, he was surprised not to see Ngoc Ha come out to see him off. Thinking maybe she was busy with something, after a few seconds of hesitation, Tuan withdrew the boat to the middle of the stream, started the engine and drove quickly because it was starting to get dark. The wind was a bit strong, so Tuan let the boat run close to the shore. The sun had just disappeared behind the bamboo trees, so Tuan had to keep his eyes open and run, not paying attention to an object moving slightly in the middle of the boat. Until a series of giggles rang out, startling Tuan. Who is that? This is a beauty. Give me a ride, I'm cold. Tuan was about to turn off the engine to stop the boat, but was commanded by the girl's voice. If you're running in reverse, why don't you turn off the engine and let the boat drift, just run? Now his voice sounded clearer. Tuan exclaimed. River. Why are you here? I saw you up a while ago, and then I looked to say goodbye and couldn't find you. She giggled again. People hid under the boat without knowing, probably thinking of another beauty. Right, it's getting dark, so let me go home. If I do this, I'll have to take you back and I won't be able to get home until late. She coos. If you want to chase someone away, do you have to kiss him? Let people jump in and wade to shore. Tuan panicked. Do not. Let me turn the boat around. Ngoccha then said seriously. No need, I already asked Mom for permission. I have something to do at the market tonight, so I have to go there, and then go measure for a wedding dress tomorrow morning. Well, didn't you hear my mother's permission just now? Ha squinted her eyes. All you have to do is whisper to my mother and she will accept it. Especially when you're with me, but I still have to go home. I can't follow you to the market. But I also never heard you say that there is a familiar house in the market. Tuan's voice was full of doubt. Ha should have explained, but instead she tried to say. Not every acquaintance has to say everything. You don't believe I have a familiar house in the market, do you? If so, do you dare to go there with me to stay overnight? Tuan did not expect his soon-to-be wife to speak so boldly, so he opened his eyes in surprise. What are you saying? Ha, then I say what's on my mind. If you don't like it, then fine, I'll go alone. Ha angrily crawled to the bow of the boat to sit alone. Tuan couldn't give up steering the boat, so he had to go into the water. Okay, I agree. I'll stop by the house later to let my mom know, then come with me. Ha is still angry. Do not need. If I go home to report, there's no way the old lady will let me go, and then I'll turn into a spoiled girl who ran away from home to spend the night with a guy. But I'm your fiancé, not just another guy. Although he was surprised by his attitude and way of speaking more boldly than usual, he was afraid that she would be angry, so in the end Tuan agreed to go with Ngoccha. They parked the boat somewhere at the market wharf, then took each other to a motel room. Degree. When he woke up in the morning, Tuan looked around bewilderedly and couldn't find Ngoccha. He called several times and got no answer, so he quickly ran out to look. At that time, the innkeeper asked Tuan in surprise. Why did you get so drunk last night? Tuan was bewildered. When did I get drunk? Did you see the girl with me this morning? It was the boss's turn to be surprised. Which girl? So you went with me last night? There's no one there. It was I who found you lying drunk in front of this inn. I had to work very hard to drag him into the room, then he was unconscious until now. Thinking of Ha's safety, Tuan panicked. I wonder how she is. Apparently, when I came here with her, she was wearing blue clothes, the same color as the curtains there. He pointed his finger and the innkeeper shook his head. I told you you came here alone, lying out there drunk. Tuan ran back into the room. He suddenly saw a whole wig still lying on the bed, picked it up, looked at it and shouted. This is Ha's hair. He ran back out and asked in an excited voice. Who did what to my wife? The old homeowner was bewildered. What do you mean, whose hair is this? Tuan shouted loudly. What did you guys do to my wife? cutting off all of her hair and leaving it here. You guys killed her, right? Seeing Tuan upset, the boss calmly said. You shouldn't be so impatient and talk nonsense like that. I think you should go home and look again, maybe your wife is also looking for you right now. Tuan forgot to thank him and rushed home. Mrs. Suang was very happy when she saw her child return. Oh my God, where have you been all night? And I've been looking everywhere. I thought I was in an accident when I was riding the boat, so my mom sent someone to Ngoc's house to look for me. They were also surprised and said I had come back this afternoon. Tuan immediately asked, "Where is Ngoc?" Mrs. Suang pointed out and said, "Look, her mother is here." Tuan looked out and saw Ngoc walking briskly beside his mother into the house. He asked loudly, "Where have you been since last night?" Ha was bewildered. "I stay at home with my mother, where do I go?" Tuan harshly. "Why did you leave me without saying a word? It made me so worried." Mrs. Le had to intervene and speak up. "What are you talking about? Ngocha is at home, sleeping with Mom from the time I row the boat until morning. When I heard the news that you were missing, I urged you to come here quickly, but what are you saying now?" Tuan still asserted. "Last night, Ha got on the boat with me and said she had to go to the market to sleep so she could measure her wedding dress in the morning. I was afraid that Ha would be alone, so I followed her." Ha exclaimed. "Tuan is crazy, Mom." Mom thought he spoke like someone from above. Ms. Suang also said, "When the kids went to the house to report the news this morning, they saw Ngoc at the house. What did you say?" Tuan was stunned, looking first at Ha and then back at himself. Mrs. Suang started to panic. "From yesterday until now, you've always scared me. What's wrong, Tuan? Is there something on your mind?" Tuan sat down on the floor, dazed as if he had lost his soul. While Ms. Lee's voice was still steady. "Last night I was scared, so I didn't let Ha sleep alone, but fortunately, thanks to that, I couldn't doubt my daughter about what Tuan said. I thought, I need to take him to the doctor again, maybe something is not normal." Ngoc walked up to Tuan and said softly, "There must be something wrong, please calm down and remember." Tuan asked again, "Is it true that it's not you?" It took Ha a lot of skill to get Tuan to tell the story. When he told her there was still a wig at the boarding house, Ha was startled. "How is that hair?" She raised her hand to touch her hair and then shyly stepped back a bit, afraid that Tuan would touch her head. Tuan said, "Let me go get your hair back." Mrs. Suang came back and said, "His hair is still here, what are you saying?" Tuan paused, but he still muttered, "Obviously I see." Ha suddenly said, "Let me go find that place." Both mothers refused, so in the end only Tuan called a tow truck. When he returned later, Tuan's face still had a look of disappointment. "Do not have?" Ha asked. "What do you mean no?" Tuan said angrily. Apparently, he held that wig in his hand and looked at it very carefully, but when he returned, it was nowhere to be found. The old innkeeper also denied it, saying he didn't see anything. Whenever Tuan mentioned wigs, Ngoc felt like she was being scrutinized. She turned her face away, trying to avoid everyone's eyes. But actually at that time they didn't pay attention to her. Mrs. Suang told her child, "Don't scare me anymore, go rest." When leaving, Ha herself suddenly told her mother, "Mr. Tuan really encountered something, he didn't make it up." Ms. Le wondered, "But what is it? I see that this guy is becoming more and more like someone from above, not normal. Could it possibly be, possessed by ghosts, or, he went out with a girl and got scared so he made up a story?" Ha shook her head. "I don't believe so. I think Seeing her daughter hesitate, Mrs. Ellie blurted out. Or do you guys have something to hide from me? No way, Mom. Ha kept wondering about Tuan's story. The doctor's words yesterday made Ha think even more. She thought about everything that had happened over the past few days, and finally she told her mother. I want to postpone the wedding. Mrs. Ellie looked at her child in shock. Are you crazy or something? Ha said truthfully. I also have a strange feeling, especially when I remember my ghost face the night before. Seem. She touched her hair, then Mrs. Ellie suddenly remembered about the wig that Tuan said. Why don't you understand what he's talking about with his hair? Is it possible that there are people who use wigs just like me, or does he have any doubts about you? Ha shook her head. Not so right. I think Tuan really met someone. For example, meeting a girl who looks exactly like you. Mrs. Ellie shouted. Did he see a ghost? Ha lowered her voice. Maybe. Mrs. Ellie shivered. Don't say anything to scare me. But how do you know? Didn't you hear what he said clearly? If it wasn't a ghost, how could someone who looked exactly like me appear on the boat when I was still at home with my mother? Mrs. Ellie nodded. Oh yeah, he was telling a story just now, but because I was so busy asking him about something else, I forgot to think it was a ghost. That's right, only ghosts are like that. Ha pondered for a moment, then suddenly she told her mother. I have to go see Aunt Dung. Mrs. Ellie was surprised. What does Aunt Dung have to do with this? Ha pointed to her hair and said. It was she who gave me this wig. But, that's just hair, what does it have to do with anything? I've thought about it, since I got this hair until now, a lot of things have happened. Ha turned to the cyclist. He drove the car to Hamlet 4, where Heapton Rice Mill was located. Mrs. Ellie was very confused, but still followed her daughter. Aunt Dung listened carefully to Ha's words. After listening, she completely lost her usual confidence, and suddenly exclaimed. So that's right? Mrs. Ellie was surprised. What did you say? Right? Turning to Ha, she said with a slightly shaking voice. Last night and the previous few nights, every night I dreamed that there was a girl with a bald head, screaming and crying, demanding that I give her hair back. Ngoc Ha turned pale. What hair? I don't know either. I just saw that she was very beautiful, but her face was pale, and her hairless head was even more scraggly than her previous head. Every time in the dream he cries and asks for his hair back, but I don't remember that it could be the hair that I gave him. Why did you say before that this was hair bought from a salon and had a certificate? That's it, I showed you the real certificate. And this was given to me by the principal of the Western school. Having said this, she suddenly exclaimed. That's right, him. Who did you say? Mr. Henry, principal, the person who gave you the hair. Aunt Dung was a bit shy when she said. He retired a long time ago, now living in Saigon. I recently heard that he was accused of something very shocking. I didn't believe it, but people insisted it was true. Ha is curious. What's going on? Aunt, raped a girl over 10 years younger than him. Both Ms. Ellie and Ngoc Ha exclaimed. Oh my God. Ha also asked. Recently, Aunt Mrs. Dung shook her head. Old story, not recent. It happened when he was still a principal. It is said that the girl is a senior female student. Ms. Ellie clicked her tongue. Old Western men often have disabilities. Aunt Dung added. But it's not just rape. He even cruelly pushed that girl into distraught and sought death. Ngoc Ha cannot sit still. Is that another thing? And Aunt Dung looked at Ha, she lost a little confidence. Hearing that story made me worried. Especially this hair. Ha was bewildered. You mean my hair? Yes. I'm scared. She turned to Mrs. Ellie. Can't you postpone the wedding a few months, for example? Let's say the reason why Ha has to avoid her grandparents' taboo dates is something. Waiting for her hair to grow a little longer. But imagine, on the wedding night, Ha's husband discovers his wife. How to speak when wearing a wig? Ha is not as worried about that as about the principal of the Western school. She asked. Do you know his house? What is it, child? Suddenly I want to find out what he was accused of. Mrs. Ellie scolded. I'm tired of worrying about how much money I have to spend. Let him do whatever he does, he has no strength. Ha didn't argue with her mother, but she still couldn't stop thinking about it. It wasn't until that afternoon when she returned home that Ha still had questions. She asked her mother. People who died unjustly are said to be very spiritual, right? Well, he died unjustly, his soul cannot escape, so his spirit only appears. Like the victim of that Western governor, is it an unjust soul afraid that her child would ask nonsense? Mrs. Ellie interrupted. Why do you care about that? She urged Ha to go to bed early, and she obeyed. But the next morning, Ha disappeared. Mrs. Ellie panicked and ran to search everywhere. Finally, she came across an envelope left by H.A. Basically, she told her mother that she had to go to Saigon urgently. Please rest assured, don't go looking and worry. Even though she knew that, Ms. Ellie still felt like she was sitting on fire. She had a hunch that this matter must be related to the Western governor's case. Still not sure at the end. Mrs. Ellie immediately went to find her child. Invite Aunt Dung to come along, because Mrs. Ellie suspects Ngoc Ha will go to the place where the Western governor retired. And quite rightly so. When the two ladies arrived, they met Ha in contact with Mr. Henry's employee. Ms. Tem Ni, an honest maid, was very upset about that. She recounted that her voice was still agitated. It happened a long time ago, everyone thought it had sunk into oblivion, but suddenly recently it came back to life and made Mr. Tay unable to sleep or eat peacefully. But I also saw it with my own eyes. She lowered her voice as if afraid someone would hear. Not long ago, I saw a girl with a bald head standing in the middle of the house screaming and crying. Looking closely I realized it was, it. Ha asked again. Who is that? As a girl, she is the victim. This girl is Mr. Henry's personal secretary. I still remember that day, she was very beautiful and also very gentle. Suddenly one day I heard the news that she was missing. At first I thought she loved someone and then left home to build a family. But 2 months later, shocking news broke out, that secretary, my Dung, was found hanging to death behind a large pagoda near Mr. Henry's house. But she died in a very pitiful state. Besides her haggard beauty, she also had a smooth head with no hair left. Mrs. Ellie was bewildered. What's up? Ngoc Ha was also stunned. Who did what to her? Tam Ni said as if about to cry. She shaved her head and asked for refuge in Buddha before she died. Ha was seriously shocked. Oh God, if you have taken refuge, why are you still looking for death? That is what makes Mr. Henry regret and suffer extremely. Ha blurted out. Did he know in advance what was going to happen and couldn't prevent it? Tam Ni nodded. You're right. When the incident about the relationship between him and Ms. Mai Dung happened, he arranged for her to quit her job and go away. They rented a house to live in and planned to wait until after Mr. Henry had completed the divorce proceedings with his wife to officially marry Ms. Mai Dung. Then suddenly, without knowing who would reveal it, the old wife Mr. Henry went to the place and made a mess, humiliating Ms. Maidung, so much so that she had to run to the temple to ask for shelter. Then that night, after asking for refuge, she shaved her long hair past her back, wrapped it up, asked the temple to send it back to her lover, and then she snuck out behind the temple and hanged herself. Ngoc Ha suddenly exclaimed, "This hair." Then she turned to Aunt Dung. "You said it was Mr. Henry who gave you this hair." Aunt Dung nodded. "That's right. But he said he bought it at a big store." Tam and I was surprised. "What hair?" Ha stroked her hair and said, "The hair I'm wearing." Looking closely, she exclaimed, "Right. In the past, Ms. Maidung had hair exactly like this." Then she revealed, "I remember, one day, Mr. Henry asked me to take Ms. Maidung's long hair to a hair salon and have them tie it together, then put it in a box, he said, to keep it as a souvenir." Ha said, feeling cold all over. "Right?" She looked at Aunt Dung, her voice trembling. "What to do now? Aunt Mrs. Le is also afraid." "Quickly take off your hair." At this point Tam and I understood everything. She said, "If you're scared, I have a way. At the hair salon nearby, they have many different types of wigs. You should go there so they can change them and return this hair to Mr. Henry." Aunt Dung also agreed. "Or you should do that, Ha." Ngoc Ha went with Tam and I to the hair salon, and to her surprise, the shop owner immediately said when she saw Ha walk in, "Someone came here to message Ms. Ngoc Ha, that if you want your hair back, go immediately to your husband's house, someone is waiting for you there." Ha asked again, "Who is my relative?" The shop owner took out a small piece of paper with a few words written on it. Ha read enough for everyone around to hear. "Maidung." Tam and I exclaimed in shock. "Here she is." Ha remained silent in fear. However, she still had to change her hair, because she could not dare to bring back the long hair that she liked so much. Although she still wanted to stay, remembering the words on the note, Ha urged her mother to go home. Ha and her mother got on the bus to return home immediately, but unfortunately for them, the car they were traveling in had an accident, and nearly a dozen people were injured on the bus, among them were Ha and her mother. Ha was injured in the head again, so she was in a coma for 2 days and 2 nights. When she woke up, she was extremely frightened when she saw that there was no hair left on her head. "Oh my God!" the nurse caring for her explained. "Her injuries are very serious. If she hadn't gotten to the hospital in time, her life could have been in danger. The doctors had to do their best. Now she is out of danger, but must stay in the hospital for a few weeks for monitoring." Ha suddenly remembered her mother and asked, "Where is my mother?" The nurse replied, "She's okay, but she also broke her leg and is lying in another room." And the nurse wondered. "According to the address your mother gave you, the hospital sent someone to send a telegram home, but it's been 2 days since anyone has come to take care of the patient. Even her husband's house." Ha was startled. "Why do my husband's side often do this?" "My head." She touched her hair, afraid. Suddenly the nurse said, "When treating a wound, you need to shave your hair to make it easier for surgery." That's when we knew she was wearing a wig. It was I who untied her bun and placed it at the head of this bed, but the next morning it somehow disappeared. Ha was stunned for a long time, until the nurse asked, "Are you planning on getting your wig done again if you need it? Someone just brought you a box of wigs, I left it at your bedside," she said as she took the paper box back. Just as she was about to open it, Ha screamed, "Do not!" The box contained a wig that Ha immediately recognized at first glance as the hair she sent back to Tam and I to deliver to Mr. Henry. Why is it here? The nurse said. I think maybe someone knew she lost her hair and gave her new hair. Who is the person who brought this box? The nurse shook her head. I don't know either, I just saw it lying there in the on-call room. On the box there was a request to deliver it to the patient named Ngoc Ha in room number 3, so I knew it was sent to her. Ha is scared. Please take it out, I don't need it. Suddenly the nurse saw a piece of paper at the bottom of the box. She took it out and gave it to Ha, with the words, "Don't refuse, bring it in when you leave the hospital. If you don't have hair, you will lose your husband." Ngoc Ha was shocked. She muttered, "Who is that?" Looking closely again, it was clear that my hair had grown recently. Ha was still hesitating when the nurse urged, "You should receive it and put it in the other cabinet, lock it, leave it outside in case you lose it again." There was no other way, so Ha had to accept it, and once again she had to worry about the name My Dung. Stayed in the hospital for 10 days, but still no one from her husband's family, including Tuan, came to visit. Mrs. Le herself was also surprised. Mom has asked someone to send telegrams twice, but why haven't they come to visit on the 12th day? Ms. Le and her mother were discharged from the hospital. Ngoc Ha was in a forced position, so she had to wear My Dung's wig. Mrs. Le was worried when she remembered the wedding day had passed. She said, "I can't contact my husband and children, I don't know what they're up to down there, so naturally I'm worried." Ha is also restless. "My intuition tells me that something seems to be going on." And something happened. When they returned, they heard the news from their family. The wedding has already taken place. Mr. Tuan got married, the wedding was on the scheduled date, but why didn't his mother have a mother in his bride's family? Only the children were brought over there with Ms. Ha. And Mom too, why didn't she come home that day, leaving Ms. Ha alone? She was so sad. Mrs. Le was bewildered. Why did that happen? Ha and I had an accident and thought we were going to die. We were in the hospital and just came back today, so who are we getting married to? Ngoc Lean, Ha's younger brother, was also confused. At the wedding, I saw Ms. Ha wearing a gorgeous wedding outfit. I thought she probably just went to Saigon to buy it. Ms. Ha even waved at me. What did you say? That side of the family also said that because Mom had been gone for too long, they were afraid of missing work, so they held the wedding right away. We'll figure it out when Mom comes back. Mrs. Le was angry and shouted, "Dishonest, ungrateful soldier. Taking advantage of someone having an accident to marry another wife?" But Ha's younger brother said, "I see it's Ms. Ha, is there anyone else?" Ha stood up and said in a serious voice, "This case is not simple anymore. It's also related to your safety. Mom, let me go over there." After she finished speaking, Mrs. Le did not have time to stop her, so she had to urge Ngoc Lean and her to follow. When they arrived, they saw that the wedding tent was still there. Although the house was less bustling, it was still crowded. As soon as everyone saw Ha walk in, they were surprised and asked, "Wow, Auntie Ba just went on her honeymoon, why did she come back so quickly?" Ngoc Ha opened her eyes. "Whose honeymoon? My aunt's tense." Just then, Mrs. Suang walked out. She frowned and asked, "Why did you come back? Where is Tuan?" Ha was already upset about Tuan getting married and the bride was not her, so she said, "Can you still ask? Mom must know where Tuan is going better than anyone else, right?" Mrs. Suang was surprised. "Hey, what's wrong?" Ha vented so much frustration. "I didn't expect you to be an adult and behave like that. Why haven't you asked the whole story yet? While I was away from home for a few days, Mom got married to Tuan." "Mom, you know that a few days ago, I had a near-fatal accident and almost didn't make it back. Mrs. Suang was bewildered. What do you say? I don't understand what caused the accident, and why did my mother marry another wife for Tuan So who will be the bride and then go on their honeymoon with Tuan? As soon as Ngoc Lin and her mother arrived, she spoke up. Ms. Ha, I said I'm not the one at the wedding. She and my mother were in the hospital for more than 10 days before returning here. Mrs. Suang seemed to fall from the sky. She stammered. Is that, something like that? Then she went back into the house and asked the maids. Do you know where Tuan took his wife? One person said. Yes, I heard Uncle Ba say to take Aunt Ba to Saigon for a week. Here, Uncle Ba left his address, saying this is Aunt Ba's familiar house. Ha grabbed the piece of paper with the address and panicked. Street 20, do you remember Phuc Hoa Pagoda is also on this street there. Ms. Mai Dung hanged herself. Both mother and daughter were stunned. Then Ha ran away in panic, screaming. It's not done, Mr. Tuan. Ha ran to the bus station. Fortunately, there was still a night bus, so Ha didn't have to wait until the next morning. That express bus took Ha back to Saigon very early. As soon as she arrived at the bus station, Ha called a tow truck to 20th Street. Afraid of not remembering the place, Ha asked the driver. Do you know Phuc Hoa Pagoda on 20 Mua Street? The rickshaw puller seemed knowledgeable. The temple has a girl who committed suicide. Who here doesn't know that temple? Especially recently, people know it more and more, because the ghost appears every night to scare passers-by, making everyone stunned and heartbroken. Ha is curious. Is that true, Uncle? The rickshaw puller shuddered. Ghost stories are not a joke, let's talk about it. Just yesterday, with my own eyes, when passing passengers, I saw a man dressed as a groom, running from outside into the temple yard, and from there crawling to the back of the temple, where I heard that a girl hanged herself before. I didn't dare run in to see, but I heard rumors that any man who runs in there is considered to be taking the life of the unjustly strangled ghost. Poor certain man. Ha panicked. Why don't you help people? She got off the bus in front of the temple and her mind thought that Tuan was in danger. Running straight into the temple, not seeing anyone, Ha went straight to the back of the temple. At the base of the old tree, it was clear that Tuan was kneeling alone. Ha walked forward and was about to call out when he suddenly saw in front of Tuan, hanging down from a tree branch, was the body of a woman. Looking closer, Ha discovered that the person hanging there had almost no hair on his head. Tuan seemed to be in a daze, his eyes looking towards the body seemed to be looking somewhere far away. He didn't even hear Ha's very close footsteps. Until Ha called out. Handsome. Still like a wooden statue, after Ha called twice, Tuan did not respond. Suddenly he fell forward when Ha called for the third time. As soon as Tuan fell, the other body also fell from the tree to the ground. Before Ha could react, her eyes turned dark and her body staggered. An old Frenchman who spoke Vietnamese fluently shouted when he saw Ha and Tuan regain consciousness. Lucky. Tuan looked at him bewildered, while Ha sat up immediately. You are Tam Ni's familiar voice. This is Mr. Henry whom I told about last time. He was informed by Miss Mai Dung's spirit so he came here to save the two of them. Ha looked at him holding a bag and was suspicious. This man is the culprit who caused Ms. Mai Dung's death, so how could her ghost let him save her? Tam Ni pointed to the bag Mr. Henry was holding next to him and said. He arrived in time and put Ms. Mai Dung's body in that bag, so she wouldn't bother anyone anymore. Mr. Henry himself spoke up. Mai Dung is a ghost, but she is not always evil or harmful to people. The evidence is new, it was the good soul in her that did not let this guy die. Ha, harshly. But it was she who pretended to be me to trick my husband into marrying her and bringing my husband here. If I hadn't arrived in time, would my husband have been harmed by her? Mr. Henry's voice was still gentle. It's true that she did that. But that's what the evil spirit in my dung did. And after bringing this boy here, it was the good soul in her that overcame the evil side, thanks to which her husband was able to escape death, otherwise he would have been the one to hang from a tree branch, instead of her. My dung. Ha heard it was strange, but she couldn't believe it right away. She was about to ask again when she suddenly heard a quite familiar voice ringing behind her. That is absolutely true. Looking back, both Ha and Tuan exclaimed. Doctor. Psychiatrist Dr. Thuan, who treated Tuan, has just appeared. He turned to Ha and explained. It was hard for her to believe what Henry said, but it was the truth. I studied books about spirituality and learned about things like Mr. Henry just said. In the soul of the dead, there are two states, when it appears or when it enters someone. Sometimes good, sometimes evil. Now Tuan spoke up. I went through such periods with her. When she appeared in the role of my wife Ngoc Ha, she was so gentle that I believed it was true. But when she needed to control me and lead her away, she was so sharp and fierce that I didn't dare to disobey her. Like when she came back here, she forced me to kneel under this ancient tree and told her that she had to take revenge, to find the person who died to replace her life so she could be reincarnated. When my wife appeared, the ghost suddenly changed its attitude very quickly, turning into a weak, unjust soul, falling to the ground motionless like a person in the mortal world. Mr. Henry gently lifted the cloth bag next to him. Thanks to that, I was able to recover her remains and rebury her. I hope that from now on, her spirit will no longer bother anyone. After speaking, he stood up and shook Dr. Thuan's hand. Thank you, old friend, for coming here to help me relieve this burden. He walked unsteadily, clutching his bag tightly as if afraid someone would snatch it away. Dr. Thuan said. Poor them. People accused him of being unfair. In fact, he loved Miss My Dung dearly and sincerely. And conversely, she also loved him purely, with a love that would not go away until death. Ha chimed in. But it was he who made her commit suicide? Dr. Thuan shook his head. I have known him for a long time and know well his relationship with Ms. My Dung. I know for sure that Miss My Dung died because she was so angry about being jealous and having her reputation defamed that she suddenly rushed to death, but in fact she still loved Henry dearly, loved her to the point of not being able to let go, tearing her apart. Doesn't melt. The evidence as we can see is that there is nothing left of a ghost's body, but because of love, that soul accumulated and allowed him to get that remains. He hopes correctly, from now on Miss My Dung's soul will no longer appear. He turned to Tuan and Ha. You are also happy, now you have escaped harassment. You can live peacefully together. Tuan asked. I still don't understand why we have nothing to do with her, so why does her soul follow me around? Dr. Thuan looked at Ha and said. It's because of that wig. This hair, if I'm not mistaken, belongs to Ms. My Dung. The souls of the dead always follow whatever they leave behind when they die. Especially hair. Because hair is related to human blood. It was a part of Ms. My Dung's body when she was alive. It was cut before she died, meaning the life in that hair is still alive. Rather, there is still the living soul of that person. So when someone else puts it on their body, the interaction between the living and the dead is immediately followed. We can call this the soul of hair that helped My Dung follow this Ms. Ha, and from Ms. Ha she got involved with Mr. Tuan. The words he said made both Ha and Tuan shiver. They looked at each other and then clasped each other's hands, as if afraid of being separated again. Tam and I was also cold when she said, "So who dares to use wigs anymore?" Dr. Thwan shook his head and said, "That's not right. The case of the phenomenon I just mentioned is when the person who leaves behind hair is unjustly killed or forced to die. But it's okay for a normal person to die." Before leaving that place, the psychiatrist patted Tuan's shoulder and added, "As a Western medicine doctor, if you talk about spirituality and nonsense, people will laugh at you. But I'm also a spiritualist. I research and know a lot about the soul, about the spiritual world." He's been gone for a long time, but Tuan and Ha are still standing still. Moments later, he suddenly remembered. Tuan softly told his wife, "Let's go home right away so my mom won't be at home worrying." Ha said very quietly, "Married a ghost wife and now you're forced to take her place, right?" Tuan hugged Ha tightly. "This wife's appearance is even more evil than a ghost, so the ghost must give up her love. Now please, ladies." They walked hand in hand with their hearts filled with happiness. Maybe thanks to what happened, they feel more love for each other. Degree. Mrs. Suang was very happy to see her two children return. There were also Mrs. Le and Ngoc Lean there. They said together, "Two people returning from their honeymoon are different." After that, the two mothers cautiously said enough for Ha and Tuan to hear. "To avoid any more troubles from happening, maybe I have to bring my teacher back to eliminate the spirit that has been plaguing me for a long time." Ha said seriously. "No need, Mom." Tuan added, "Not only do we not need to welcome any of our teachers, but on the contrary, we will set up a page to worship her soul. A pitiful, precious person." Ha also agreed. "I will be the one who worships her every day." No one objected. And since that day, in Tuan and his wife's private room there has been an additional altar. They didn't have a photo of my dung, so instead of a portrait, Ha placed on the altar a lock of hair that she had borrowed for a while. A year later, Ha gave birth to her first child. On the day before her birth, Ha dreamed of a girl with a bald head, called her and said, "Named my first child Myhan, that's the name I should have had but didn't have time." Waking up, Ha told Tuan. He nodded in agreement immediately. "Anyway, I still owe her. Then we should follow her advice and name the baby Myhan, if it is a girl. I suspect it is a girl. Tiny belly." As expected, Ha gave birth to a beautiful baby girl. The girl's name is Myhan. The end.
Thank you for taking the time to watch Ghost Stories video. Hopefully the content has brought you interesting and meaningful moments. Don't forget to like, share and subscribe to the Ghost Stories YouTube channel to follow the channel's next videos. See you in the next video. Have a good day.